Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Teddy Roosevelt, the Trustbuster, Episode 3, Breaking Standard by Extra History. So last time we saw as Ida Tarbell continued her investigation into John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, and we saw as President Theodore Roosevelt took his first big swing at regulating these trusts. Today, we will see the continuation of both of those storylines. Now, before we get into this one, I'd very much appreciate it if you guys would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
Election night, November 8th, 1904. President Theodore Roosevelt eats dinner with his family, awaiting results. It had been a rough campaign.
Yeah, there's been a lot of attacks from his enemies. There's also been the sort of tension within his own party, right? Theodore Roosevelt, he is a part of the Republican Party, and American politics have been becoming increasingly corporate. There is a lot of money from big business flowing into American politics during this era. Teddy Roosevelt, well, he is a progressive. He is very much not necessarily opposed to big business, but he is in support of regulating it. There's even some corporate money floating around his campaign, so you can sort of imagine the tension between his ideals, all of the money that's being infused into the Republican Party, and a lot of other Republican politicians who are far more pro-big business.
Conservatives in his party had planned to oust Roosevelt, this unelected radical, at the convention, and only failed because their candidate died.
Yeah, and so Teddy Roosevelt, not necessarily the most popular guy within his own party, but he will grow a very large public base of popularity amongst the American people, and of course, he's remembered very fondly today. And you know, Mark Hanna, interesting fellow, he died. He was never president. He did not make it that far. Maybe he would have if he hadn't died, but who knows? Still a very influential fellow. Mark Hanna managed McKinley's presidential campaigns. He's often seen as the inventor of the sort of modern presidential campaign. He really had this unprecedented degree of centralization and fundraising. I mean, that's what he was really good at, which makes a lot of sense when we think about presidential campaigns today. A lot of fundraising goes on. Mark Hanna, he really inaugurated a lot of these behaviors and practices that would become common in the years to follow. So, he died before he made it to the presidency, but he was still a very influential guy.
Plus, with it considered unseemly to campaign while in office, because that used to be a thing, Roosevelt had to leave.
Well, and we're getting pretty late in that process. We've had presidents who have campaigned before this, and presidents will more and more campaign for themselves, but it's sort of this old, noble idea that, well, though one might want the position, one cannot make it too obvious, right? Sort of the idea of the man who doesn't want power, but is best suited for the job. Sort of a very Washingtonian idea, right? George Washington, please be president. And he says, well, I don't want to, but I'll do it for the good of the country. Now, let's be honest, none of these guys are like that. All of these guys very much want to be president. There is not a whole lot of that old nobility, but they still have to sort of pretend. They have to play into that practice. Though, like I said, the idea of, well, you shouldn't run for your own campaign is sort of fading away.
Speeches and rallies to surrogates like William Howard Taft. Meanwhile, his Democratic opponent, Alton Parker, painted Roosevelt as erratic and owned by the trusts.
Yeah.
Parker had even claimed that Roosevelt's campaign manager had used his former position as head of the new Bureau of Corporations to shake companies down for donations.
And, of course, it seems ridiculous to us that, Teddy Roosevelt in the pocket of big business? I don't think so, but, as I mentioned, there was sort of big corporate money floating around even Teddy's campaign. I believe he took money from some of these big trusts. And so we can see, of course, he worked to regulate them, but it might not be a fair critique to make that, hey, wait a minute. First of all, your party is absolutely swamped in this corporate lobbying money. Second of all, you're taking money from these big trusts, so whose side are you really on?
A lie that Parker embarrassingly retracted when Roosevelt challenged him to provide evidence. But now, the first telegrams begin to come in. It's a historic landslide, and by 9 p.m., Parker concedes. For the first time, the American
Yeah.
people have chosen Roosevelt as their leader.
Like I said, Teddy Roosevelt, a lot of tension within his own party, but very popular amongst the general public.
And they've given him a mandate to go after the trusts.
Yes, they have. Yes, they have.
Thanks so much to Brilliant for helping us present today's historic tale. The election of 1904 was, up until that time, one of the most decisive in American history.
Wow.
Roosevelt won the Electoral College 336 to 140 and captured 18.8% more of the popular vote than Parker. The highest popular vote margin since 1820, when Martin Van Buren ran unopposed.
Unopposed and on the coattails of Andrew Jackson, so it's a pretty impressive achievement from Teddy there.
The only thing that hurt him was the issue of campaign contributions.
Yup.
Parker had pointed out that Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and other magnates had made enormous donations to Roosevelt's political campaign, implying that he had been bought out by Standard. In fact, the attack...
Yeah, and like I said, we can look in retrospect and say, well, clearly he wasn't bought out by these big companies because he would go on to regulate them more forcefully than any other president. But if you're looking at the campaign, it is a fair critique to make at that time.
was so worrying, Roosevelt's campaign manager had even tried to get the president to decline the corporate donations and rely instead on small individual contributions from supporters.
Pretty modern idea. Though, I say that, it's kind of a funny thing to say, right? Because at one point in American history, big corporate money was not a big part of the process. Then it became a big part of the process and remains a big part of the process today. But in sort of modern American politics, you do see this idea reemerging that, well, maybe all of our politicians shouldn't be taking money from big corporations, and maybe the fundraising should be done through the people, through their supporters, right? So it's kind of funny, modern idea. Well, it's more about the role of corporate money in politics and how, of course, sort of before your mid to late 1800s, it was less of an influence because there just was less corporate money. But ever since the American economy sort of industrialized, it's been a big problem.
But rather than seeing money in politics as a systematic problem that needed fixing, Roosevelt interpreted the attack a slight against his honor. He preferred to keep the contributions as a way to show that no matter if Rockefeller gave $100,000 to his campaign, he was still going to pursue Standard.
Yeah, and I mean, I get that perspective, but as we have seen, we have, the beauty of hindsight. Maybe Teddy Roosevelt can honorably take the money and, not have it influence him, but that is not how it works with anybody else. Unfortunately, when we have all this corporate money flowing through the system, people make different choices than they otherwise would.
He felt that turning away the donations would be a signal that he'd done something wrong. And now that he'd won, he'd prove how wrong Parker had been. Armed with the Sherman Antitrust Act, his new Bureau of Corporations, a progressive press stoking outrage against monopolies, and a huge popular mandate, Roosevelt was finally in position to do battle against trust abuse.
It's not the traditional centers of power he has behind him. His Bureau of Corporations, a progressive press, the general public, these are not necessarily the strongest pillars of American politics. Usually we might look to sort of big money, big business, these political parties. As we've talked about, Teddy Roosevelt, he doesn't necessarily have support from a lot of those sectors. There's a lot of tension, but he can turn to this new realm of public support, which he very effectively utilizes.
Just in time for an opportunity to fall right into his lap. Oil drilling had been going on in Kansas since 1860, but output was low until an independent driller hit a gusher in 1892. It was the first strike in what's now known as the Mid-Continent Field, an oil deposit eventually determined to stretch from Kansas through Oklahoma to Texas and Louisiana. Independent producers...
And think about sort of our big oil-producing states today. I mean, Oklahoma, Louisiana... You might think of Texas first and foremost, right? That's where a lot of the oil is. I mean, in America, we've got a lot of oil in a lot of places, but, especially right there.
Rushed in to drill, followed by Standard Oil. At first, the independents were actually happy for Standard to be there. It put up oil pipelines and arranged railroad systems to transport the oil out, as well as establishing refineries. But then when it controlled all of the ways to get oil out, Standard raised the transportation.
Yeah, why exactly do you think Standard Oil is building all of this infrastructure? Is it to lift up the market, help the small producer? No. It builds the infrastructure so that it can dominate and monopolize it. That's something that remains consistent with a lot of these big companies. They sort of build up the infrastructure, and great. Everyone can use this for whatever specific business we're talking about. But once they have it, well, they just monopolize it for themselves, and everybody else gets pushed out of the market. That's sort of the danger of this.
Costs and flooded the market with cheap oil, causing independent producers that had been making over $1 a barrel to now only making around 35 cents. No one could make a profit, and they were either going out of business or headed for buyouts. So they sounded the alarm, and Ida Tarbell showed up.
There she is.
To get there, she traveled by horse-drawn wagon through the worst sandstorm in decades. But when she arrived, she was greeted as something between a hero and a prophet. Hosted with parades, forced to give speeches from her hotel window, followed by reporters.
I guess that's what happens when your journalism is so influential. You become a political figure, on your own terms, right? And of course, Ida Tarbell, I mean, her style was pretty modern in that we're talking about sort of empirical, evidence-based investigative journalism. But there was no veneer of objectivity. She absolutely came at it with an agenda. She wanted to discover what was going on, particularly with Standard Oil, and uncover all of the corruption behind the scenes and expose it to people, right? That was her agenda. And she used these, as we said, sort of rather advanced methods to achieve that. So now she's done that. She has, achieved great success with her journalism. It sort of shifted her into a new realm. She's a very popular figure, and she has a lot of influence on her own.
It seemed she'd become the most famous woman in America. And though the crowds disturbed her writing, her celebrity meant more people approached her to tell their stories.
Right.
And those stories were familiar. It seems Standard Oil was following the same playbook they'd used during the Pennsylvania oil wars of her youth.
Of course.
Using secret railroad rebates and price fixing to drive competitors out. Playing favorites on pipeline rates, bribing legislators to sink or blunt proposed antitrust laws, even tampering with juries. But as she wrote her article, she got a visit from James R. Garfield, the son of the former president and the current commissioner of the Bureau of Corporations. It seemed he was going down to Kansas himself to look into Standard's practices and was using Tarbell's notes as a guide.
How about that? Not only has Tarbell been influential in exposing all of this, now, this new Bureau of Corporations, the government, is saying, you know what? We actually want to use your notes, because you're doing the best job.
He verified every point she made, and then went back to Washington to help craft a two-pronged legal offensive against Standard. The first case would be based on the illegal rebates Standard had received, while the other would be a Sherman Antitrust Act suit, claiming the company was an illegal monopoly acting in restraint of trade. The illegal rebates case was the easiest to prosecute. It began in March 1907, when the government formally charged Standard Oil of Indiana with 1,903 violations of the Elkins Act, the railroad rates law Roosevelt had pushed through in 1903. There's a fun numerical coincidence. The jury found Standard guilty on all of those counts, and the judge issued a subpoena to Rockefeller, compelling him to testify about Standard's operations in order to assess the size of the penalty. U.S. Marshals fanned out from Chicago, visiting every residence Rockefeller owned. But Rockefeller had defied subpoenas before. When state courts investigating Standards served him in the past, he exploited their limited power by simply never going in person to that state.
There you go. Another example of the amount of power these big business magnates like Rockefeller had, and the lack of power the government had to regulate them, at least up until this point. He had, in a sort of very fuzzy way, it's like, okay, is he breaking the law? Is this illegal? Or is he just using his legal rights? Sort of in the middle, but he managed to avoid prosecution, though Teddy's really coming for him at this point.
Yet the U.S. Marshals were unrelenting, trying to slip past his armed Pinkerton guards and causing him to move from house to house in secrecy. It couldn't last. July 6th,
Just go to court, homie. Come on. You got a subpoena. Just go to court.
1907, Chicago. There's a crowd outside the courthouse, yelling at Rockefeller as his guards muscle their way through. The game is up, it seems. He's too old to keep running, so he's come here to testify. But with a strategy. On the stand, as the judge questions him, Rockefeller plays a semi-senile old man. He flubs basic facts, claims not to be able to...
Good strategy. Good strategy. Maybe not best for your public image, right? It's not going to make you look particularly good, although maybe people would just feel sorry for you, I don't know. But in terms of avoiding responsibility for your actions, pretty brilliant strategy. The classic, I don't recall, but pumped up. Like, so I don't even understand what's going on. It's like, well, great.
To remember events or details from just a few years earlier, and repeats over and over that he'd stepped back from managing Standard over a decade ago. In one way, it works. John D. Rockefeller will not be going to prison. But in another way, it definitely doesn't. Because the judge decides to levy the maximum fine on every single rebated rail car. All 1,903 of them fining Standard Oil of Indiana a whopping $29,240,000. It drew a gasp in the courtroom. The fine was by far the largest ever levied on an American corporation to that date. Granted, it would be appealed the next year, and a different judge eventually reversed it on a technicality. But just the fact that a judge had actually ruled against the trust...
That is pretty significant. I will say, oftentimes the fines that are doled out to these companies violating laws, they're big numbers, but they're not significant enough to actually make a difference. I would say in this case, the very fact that the case was brought against Standard Oil, and then a guilty verdict was read, that in itself is significant, sort of a sign of the changing times.
And ruled hard in more ways than one, encouraged prosecutors that they could now win in this arena.
Right.
And the hits kept coming. In 1908, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst read out a series of letters he'd obtained, where the vice president of Standard, John Archbold, sent multiple $15,000 checks to a senator and discussed antitrust legislation. Not a good look. Meanwhile, the Justice Department prepared its second case against Standard. It took years and 20,000 pages worth of supporting documents. But in 1909, the U.S. government sued Standard of New Jersey, the parent company of Rockefeller's empire. The Justice Department claimed that Standard was an illegal monopoly that used anti-competitive means like rebates, price fixing, undercutting, secretly operating companies claiming to be independent, and espionage against competitors to restrain trade.
True.
The U.S. government won. And when Standard appealed to the...
I mean, we've seen all this before. We've seen it through the reporting of Ida Tarbell. It has become uncovered, and now they're being punished for it.
Supreme Court, the U.S. government won again in an 8-1 decision.
Wow.
With the one dissenter essentially saying the decision didn't go far enough.
Wow.
The judgment meant...
That's quite a decision. Not technically unanimous, but, like, that's sort of even beyond unanimous. They made a decision. The only dissent was, hey, you should have gone even further. That is pretty rare for the Supreme Court.
And that Standard Oil...
Well, it's rare these days.
...would be broken up into 34 companies. Rockefeller got the news of the breakup by telegram while he was on the golf course with a priest. It wasn't a surprise by then, and Standard had been prepared.
Not a surprise to him at that point, but, I mean, this is a major, major moment. We're talking about some real bona fide trust busting. This is beyond just fining or sort of low-level regulation. This is breaking up this trust. It's a big deal.
Preparing a game plan. Rockefeller turned to the priest and said, "If you have any money, buy stock in Standard Oil." Then he went on to shoot the best golf game of his life. And Rockefeller was right. As the breakup happened, forming 34 baby Standards, the company's stock went through the roof. And Rockefeller personally owned 25%.
Yeah, and I will say this is a big deal, but, and we, I don't know, might sort of see this in the video, one breakup or one big regulatory burst, it doesn't last forever, or it's not enough to put the company into the ground or truly split it up or whatever. More action needs to follow. And so the consequences of this are perhaps not as overwhelming as one might imagine, though it's absolutely a very big moment in this whole story. I don't want to downplay that.
Of Standard. It quadrupled his wealth, making Rockefeller the first ever billionaire and probably at the time the richest man on earth. And the Standard of yesterday became the companies we all know today. Standard of New Jersey became Esso, and after another merger, Exxon. Standard of New York became Mobil, Standard of California became Chevron, and Standard of Indiana became Amoco.
Right. And so, our oil companies of today, a lot of them are descended from Standard Oil. But there's something to be said. If you look at the breakup of Standard Oil, right? It's broken up into a bunch of different companies. If you sort of chart them over time, what you will see is that a lot of those companies have recombined. And so the companies that remain today, there's only a few of them, and they are very big, quite influential. For example, ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil, that's what we have today. And so this is broken up into a bunch of companies. They haven't remerged into one, but there's been a lot of merging that's happened over the years, right? Now, none of these hold the same influence that Standard Oil once did. Absolutely not. That's partially due to them being broken up. I also think it's sort of due to just how the times have changed. Now, oil is absolutely incredibly important today. It's probably more important right now than it was then. And of course, it was incredibly important throughout the 20th century. So it's not like oil has become less important, but I think because it's become more important, it's sort of become a little more complicated. A lot of governments have their hand in oil production. A lot of countries have nationalized their oil production. And so, honestly, I think it's a little harder for sort of one American oil company to have the sort of influence that Standard Oil once did. The game has changed. So I think, breaking the company up obviously had massive effects. But, the consequences, a lot of these companies have merged. There's still a lot of, market monopolies, particularly in specific states that still exist. And I think some of that influence that was lost might have just been due to the changing times. So it's complicated, right? Like I said, it's not like, the company's broken up, everything is all good now. It ain't that simple. It's never that simple.
Now, it's debatable whether this actually fostered the competition that the government and court contended.
Yeah.
Because those separate...
I think that very much is debatable.
The companies still maintained an old boys network and generally tried to carve up the country and stay out of each other's way.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, we didn't really return to that pre-Standard Oil market where there were a lot of small-time competing oil producers. We didn't really see that again. So I think it is debatable the impact that was had.
And in recent years, some like
There you
ExxonMobil
go.
have even begun to recombine, though none have the power or reach Standard did in its heyday.
No.
But though it was arguably an incomplete victory, a victory it was, and not the last. Because when Roosevelt first saw that landmark $29 million fine overturned by the courts, he realized the judicial branch could not take on the trusts alone. After all, Rockefeller and his ilk could always hire the best lawyers. No. To strike the trusts where it hurts, he would need legislation.
Yep.
And he knew exactly who he needed to target. The ones at the center of the illegal rebates. The railroads.
Oh,
Choo-choo.
That's a big target. That is a big... I mean, if you're looking at the big corporations of this era, you think about oil, you think about steel, you think about the banks, and you think about railroads. Railroads had an immense amount of power and influence throughout the country, so that's a tough target. But if you want to do this, that's a necessary target. All right, so we have seen Teddy's first massive, major victory against the trusts, an incomplete victory. Debatable if the impact was as intense as would have been liked, and in the long term, how much was actually changed by that is sort of unclear, I think, for a couple of reasons, right? First of all, because times have changed, so it's like, all right, how would things have been different? That's another question. If Standard Oil hadn't been broken up, what sort of market dominance would they have continued to hold? How influential would they have been? It's hard to say, because that isn't what happened. I'm sure that breaking it up was better than that alternative. Absolutely. So, it's a complex story, right? A lot of different consequences and outcomes, and it can be a little unclear sometimes, but this is still major. We're talking about major court cases, major legislation to come, major decisions. All of this is important in one way or another. So, interesting stuff. I had a good time with this one. If you guys did as well, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon. It's linked down below, all that good stuff. Now, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.